Ethan Carter had always been a man who prized accuracy and elegance. After spending 10 years overseas thriving as an artist and designer, he returned to his native town with a clear mission: to renovate the old Victorian residence he had inherited from his deceased aunt. The house was situated on the outskirts of a wealthy suburban area, a distinctive and somewhat aged structure that had once been a prominent feature of the community. Its dulled green shutters and elaborate wooden embellishments suggested its past splendor, and Ethan recognized in it a chance not only to preserve a fragment of his family's heritage, but also to craft something genuinely stunning. Ethan was not someone who craved the spotlight. He cherished his solitude and preferred peaceful, uninterrupted work. The property had remained dormant for years, and many neighbors barely recalled his aunt, let alone knew who he was. Upon moving in, Ethan immediately embarked on the meticulous task of restoring the house to its original magnificence. He enlisted experts to strengthen the framework, sourced antique materials from various parts of the nation, and even imported decorative stones from Italy to lay the long driveway leading up to the residence. To finalize the appearance, he commissioned a bespoke wrought iron gate in an elaborate Art Nouveau design, a bold and striking piece that perfectly framed the driveway while providing a sense of security and privacy. For Ethan, the gate was more than just a functional addition. It was a piece of art, thoughtfully crafted to harmonize with the house's architectural style. He had navigated all necessary procedures, obtaining permits, consulting with local building inspectors, and ensuring the gate complied with every city regulation. Yet, even before the gate was completely installed, it began to draw attention from the neighbors. Many simply stared as they walked by, intrigued by the extensive renovation underway. Some neighbors whispered among themselves, questioning whether the extravagant design suited the neighborhood. None of this concerned Ethan. He wasn't undertaking the project to satisfy others, but to fulfill his personal vision. The house was his, and he had every right to restore it as he deemed appropriate. Among the intrigued spectators, one neighbor stood out. Karen, a woman in her mid-50s with impeccably styled hair and an air of self-importance, lived 2 houses down. She had resided in the area for over 2 decades and viewed herself as an unofficial guardian of the community's aesthetics. To her, anything that strayed from the neighborhood's established appearance was problematic. Ethan's project, with its daring artistic flair and unconventional design, was precisely the type of endeavor that unsettled her. Initially, Karen's interest was limited to passive observation. She would position herself at the boundary of her property, arms folded, watching the workers come and go. Occasionally, she would make brief remarks to passing neighbors, her voice just loud enough for Ethan to catch phrases like, "It's so out of place, don't you think?" Or, "Who needs a gate like that in our neighborhood?" Ethan chose to disregard her, concentrating on the restoration. He had encountered individuals like Karen before, those who couldn't tolerate anything that challenged their narrow perceptions of how things should be. However, Karen's silent disapproval soon escalated into something more confrontational. One morning, as Ethan oversaw the final installation of the gate, Karen strode up the driveway with a determined demeanor. "Excuse me," she called out, her voice sharp and authoritative. Ethan turned to face her, already anticipating the forthcoming complaint. "I couldn't help but notice your gate," she began, her tone laced with forced courtesy. "It's quite unusual, isn't it? Don't you think it's a bit excessive for a neighborhood like this?" Maintaining his composure, Ethan responded calmly, "It aligns with the house's style." He gestured towards the residence, its partially restored facade already revealing the ongoing transformation. "And I have all the necessary permits, if that's your concern." Karen's expression stiffened slightly. She hadn't anticipated his thorough preparation. "Well, it's not just about permits," she continued, her voice adopting a more condescending tone. "It's about the character of the neighborhood. We maintain certain standards here, and we prefer consistency. Your gate stands out too much, don't you agree?" Ethan resisted the urge to show his irritation. He knew where this conversation was headed and had no intention of yielding to Karen's sense of entitlement. "I appreciate your concern," he said politely but firmly. "However, this is my property, and I've ensured everything complies with local regulations. I don't believe I'm breaking any rules." Karen opened her mouth to retort, but before she could, a worker called out to Ethan, seeking his input on the final gate adjustments. Ethan gave Karen a brief nod and turned away, effectively ending the interaction. Karen lingered for a moment, visibly displeased, muttering something under her breath as she returned to her home, her posture rigid with indignation. In the ensuing days, Ethan observed an uptick in neighbors loitering near his property, their conversations filled with hushed tones and furtive glances. It was evident that Karen had started to voice her discontent, rallying others to her cause. While most neighbors seemed content to watch from a distance, a few began making pointed remarks as they passed by. "We preferred it before all this began," one woman loudly remarked to her companion as they walked past the driveway. Another man muttered, "It doesn't fit the neighborhood at all." Ethan chose to ignore these comments, focusing instead on completing the restoration. Having faced criticism throughout his career as an artist, he knew better than to let the opinions of a few disgruntled neighbors affect him. Nevertheless, he couldn't shake the feeling that this was merely the beginning. Karen didn't appear to be the type to relent easily, and her increasing influence over the neighbors was becoming more apparent. One evening, as Ethan was storing his tools, he noticed Karen again at the edge of her property, this time with a few other neighbors gathered around her. They spoke in low voices, occasionally glancing in Ethan's direction. Ethan felt a knot of tension tighten in his chest. He wanted to avoid conflict, but it was clear that Karen was determined to create one. Locking up for the night, Ethan resolved to stay ahead of whatever strategy Karen was employing. He couldn't predict her next move, but he had a sinking feeling that things were about to become significantly more complicated. The tranquility Ethan had diligently fostered since moving into his aunt's Victorian house was short-lived. The encounter with Karen left a lingering strain in the atmosphere, but Ethan tried to push it aside. He wasn't one to thrive on confrontation. He preferred letting his work speak for itself, confident that once the restoration was complete, the house would stand as a testament to both his skills and his late aunt's legacy. However, it soon became apparent that Karen had no intention of letting the matter rest quietly. A few days after their initial conversation, Ethan was awakened early by the blaring sound of a car horn outside his gate. Still groggy, he donned a hoodie and stepped outside to investigate the disturbance. Approaching the gate, he saw Karen on the sidewalk, signaling a police car that had just arrived. Two officers exited the vehicle, looking somewhat perplexed by the situation. Ethan opened the gate and approached them, maintaining a neutral expression. "Good morning, officers," he greeted calmly. "Is there a problem?" Before either officer could respond, Karen launched into a tirade. "Yes, there is an issue. This man has blocked off a public access road with his ridiculous gate, causing problems for the entire neighborhood. We've used this road for years, and now he's decided to cut us off without any warning." Ethan raised an eyebrow, astonished by the audacity of her claim. "This is my private driveway," he stated, addressing the officers directly. "It has always been part of this property. I have the deed and all necessary permits for the gate. This isn't a public road." One officer turned to Karen. "Ma'am, can you clarify what you mean by a public access road? This appears to be a private driveway to me." Karen folded her arms, her expression one of righteous indignation. "Legally, it may be his driveway, but the neighborhood has used it as a shortcut for years. He's disrupting the community's flow with this monstrosity of a gate. He didn't even consult the neighbors before installing it." Ethan suppressed a sigh, recognizing that this was going to be a prolonged morning. "We understand her frustration," one officer said, "but based on what you've told us, everything appears to be in order. If you have your documents handy, we can take a look." Ethan nodded and retrieved the necessary paperwork, handing them to the officers. They examined the documents carefully before returning them to Ethan with a nod. "Everything seems legitimate here. Ma'am, this is indeed private property, and Mr. Carter has every right to install a gate on his driveway." Karen's face flushed with anger, but she forced a tight-lipped smile. "Well, I suppose that's that," she said, clearly dissatisfied with the outcome. "But don't think this is the end of it. You're upsetting a lot of people here, Ethan. This neighborhood values its traditions, and we don't take kindly to outsiders coming in and changing things. With that, she turned and marched back to her house, leaving the officers and Ethan in an awkward silence. One of the officers gave Ethan an apologetic shrug. "Sorry about that. Some people just don't like change, I guess." "No worries," Ethan replied. "Thanks for coming out." The officers left, and Ethan returned to his home, but the incident left a bitter taste in his mouth. From the start, he had known Karen would be difficult, but he hadn't anticipated her involving the police over something so trivial. It was clear she wasn't going to let this go. As expected, the following day brought more strange behavior. Several neighbors who had previously been polite or indifferent towards Ethan now avoided making eye contact as they walked past his property. Some even crossed the street to avoid walking directly in front of his gate. He also overheard snippets of whispered conversations and disapproving glances directed his way. It didn't take an expert to realize that Karen had begun spreading her rumors about him. Later that afternoon, Ethan received an unexpected visit from an older couple living down the street. They introduced themselves as Jack and Maria, longtime residents of the neighborhood. Unlike Karen, they seemed friendly, though a hint of unease lingered in their demeanor. "We just wanted to stop by and say hello," Maria said with a nervous smile. "We've seen all the work you've been doing, and it looks interesting." Ethan invited them to sit on the porch, sensing they had more to discuss. After some casual conversation, Jack finally addressed the topic. "Look, Ethan, we don't want to get involved in any drama, but we thought you should know Karen's been telling everyone that your gate is illegal and that you're planning to close off access to the park at the end of the street." Ethan frowned in confusion. "The park? I'm not even near the park. That's 3 blocks away." Maria nodded. "We know, but Karen's been saying that your gate is the first step in some grand plan to divide the neighborhood and privatize parts of it. It's ridiculous, of course, but some people are starting to believe her." Ethan felt a mix of frustration and disbelief. "I appreciate you letting me know. Honestly, I'm just trying to restore this house and mind my own business. I had no idea putting up a gate would cause this much trouble." Jack sighed. "Karen's always been like this. She doesn't like change, and she doesn't like it when people don't align with her idea of what the neighborhood should be. Just be careful. She has a way of turning small issues into big problems." After the couple left, Ethan sat on the porch, contemplating his next move. He hadn't expected to become the subject of neighborhood gossip and conflict, but it was clear Karen wasn't going to stop until she achieved her goals. He needed to be proactive without escalating the situation unnecessarily. The next morning, Ethan decided to take a walk around the neighborhood to gauge the community's mood firsthand. Passing by Karen's house, he noticed a small group of neighbors gathered in her front yard. They fell silent as he approached, their eyes following him with a mix of suspicion and curiosity. Ethan nodded politely, but didn't stop to engage them. By the time he returned home, he had made up his mind. If Karen wanted to engage in a battle, he would meet her on her terms, but he would do so intelligently and legally. He spent the rest of the day reviewing his property documents again, double-checking every permit and regulation. He also contacted his lawyer to inform him of the situation, just in case things escalated further. That evening, Ethan noticed Karen standing once more at the edge of her property, watching him with her usual smug expression. He met her gaze without flinching, silently conveying that he wasn't intimidated. Whatever her next move, he would be prepared. Over the following days, it became increasingly evident that Karen had no intention of backing down. Despite the police confirming that Ethan's gate was entirely legal, she continued to stir up tension among the neighbors. Ethan frequently saw her standing in front of her house, speaking softly to passers-by and gesturing toward his property as if it were an eyesore. Although most neighbors didn't seem eager to get directly involved, Ethan sensed a growing unease in the atmosphere. It was as if Karen's persistent complaints were poisoning the once quiet street. Ethan, however, remained focused on his work. The house's restoration was progressing steadily, and despite Karen's attempts to distract him, he wasn't going to let her interfere with his plans. He spent his days coordinating with contractors, finalizing interior designs, and ensuring every detail of the project was executed flawlessly. Yet, even as he maintained his composure, he couldn't entirely ignore the tension brewing outside his property. One morning, Ethan woke up to find something unusual in his mailbox, a folded piece of paper without an envelope, stuffed inside haphazardly. He opened it and quickly realized it was an anonymous note. The handwriting was messy, almost hurried, and the message was simple but threatening. "Take down the gate, or there will be consequences." Ethan stared at the note for a few moments, feeling a wave of irritation mixed with disbelief. Was this Karen's doing? Had she persuaded a neighbor to escalate matters? Rather than react impulsively, Ethan decided to document the incident. He took a photo of the note and placed it in a folder containing all the paperwork related to his property. He wasn't going to escalate things unnecessarily, but if Karen or anyone else attempted something more serious, he wanted to be prepared. The note might have seemed like an isolated incident, but it was just the beginning. Later that afternoon, as Ethan was reviewing design plans with one of his contractors, he noticed something strange near the edge of his property. A group of neighborhood kids, no older than 12 or 13, were loitering near the gate, giggling and pointing at it. Normally, Ethan wouldn't have given it a second thought, but their behavior seemed off. When they saw him watching, they quickly scattered, running down the street. That evening, when Ethan went out to lock the gate, he noticed fresh scratches along the metalwork, long, jagged lines etched across the otherwise pristine surface. Someone had clearly used a sharp object to deface it deliberately. Ethan felt his frustration surge. This wasn't just neighborhood gossip anymore. Someone was actively trying to intimidate him. While he didn't want to jump to conclusions, it was hard not to suspect Karen's involvement. After all, she had made it clear from the beginning that she disapproved of his gate, and as tensions escalated, it seemed likely that she or someone she had influenced was behind these petty acts of vandalism. The next morning, Ethan decided it was time to confront Karen directly. He wasn't interested in initiating a public argument, but he wanted her to know he was aware of what was happening. As he walked down the street toward her house, he noticed several neighbors watching from their porches and driveways, clearly curious about what was about to unfold. Karen, as usual, was outside tending to her meticulously maintained front garden, her expressions smug and self-satisfied. "Good morning, Karen," Ethan greeted, keeping his tone neutral but firm. She looked up, feigning surprise at his approach. "Oh, Ethan, how lovely to see you. What brings you by?" Her voice was syrupy sweet, but Ethan could detect a flicker of tension in her eyes. "I just wanted to talk," he responded calmly. "There have been some incidents around my property, scratches on my gate, an anonymous note in my mailbox, and I can't help but wonder if you know anything about them." Karen's expression hardened ever so slightly, but she quickly recovered, forcing a smile back onto her face. "Incidents? Oh dear, that sounds terrible. But no, I wouldn't know anything about that. I've been too busy organizing the upcoming block party. You know, something to bring the neighborhood together, especially with all the changes happening." Ethan resisted the urge to roll his eyes. He knew exactly what she was doing, trying to deflect blame while portraying herself as the model neighbor. "I just thought I'd ask," he said evenly. "If you hear anything or see anyone acting suspiciously around my property, I'd appreciate it if you let me know." "Of course," Karen replied with an insincere nod. "We wouldn't want any more trouble, would we? I'll be sure to keep an eye out." Ethan left without saying another word. The conversation had gone exactly as he had expected. Karen wasn't going to admit to anything, but at least she knew he wasn't oblivious to what was happening. Still, as he walked back to his house, he couldn't shake the feeling that this was far from over. Karen might have feigned innocence, but Ethan was certain she was involved in some way, even if only by encouraging others to act on her behalf. That evening, Ethan made a few phone calls. First, he contacted his lawyer to inform him about the escalating situation. His lawyer advised him to keep documenting everything and suggested considering additional security measures. Ethan agreed. It was becoming increasingly clear that he needed to protect himself and his property more proactively. Next, he called a local security company and arranged for a consultation on installing a more comprehensive surveillance system. He already had a few basic cameras around the property, but they weren't sufficient to cover the entire perimeter. If things continued to escalate, He wanted clear evidence of any further incidents. By the next morning, Ethan had made up his mind. He wasn't going to allow Karen or anyone else to bully him into removing his gate or abandoning his project. The security consultant arrived and walked him through several options. Ethan opted for a system that included high-resolution cameras with night vision and motion sensors. The installation would take a few days, but once completed, Ethan would have eyes on every corner of his property. Meanwhile, Karen seemed to be intensifying her campaign. That same afternoon, Ethan received a letter in the mail, this time not anonymous. It was a formal notice signed by Karen and several other neighbors demanding that he attend a community meeting to discuss the impact of his gate on the neighborhood. Ethan couldn't help but laugh at the audacity. She was really pulling out all the stops, attempting to portray him as a villain disrupting the street's harmony. Despite how absurd it all seemed, Ethan knew he couldn't simply ignore the letter. If he didn't attend, Karen would use it as evidence that he wasn't willing to engage with the community. Reluctantly, he marked the date on his calendar. He had no doubt the meeting would be nothing more than another excuse for Karen to stir up trouble, but if that was what it took to shut her down once and for all, so be it. As the day of the meeting approached, Ethan prepared himself mentally. He reviewed his property documents again, ensuring he had everything in order. He also drafted a brief statement outlining the steps he had taken to comply with all local regulations, just in case Karen tried to question the legality of his gate again. On the morning of the meeting, Ethan woke up early and went for a long walk, trying to clear his mind. He knew that whatever happened that day, it wasn't going to be pleasant, but he was determined to stand his ground. This wasn't just about a gate anymore. It was about principle. By the time the day of the community meeting arrived, the tension in the neighborhood had reached a boiling point. Ethan, having dealt with Karen's relentless interference for weeks, knew this was just another one of her tactics to publicly undermine him. Still, he didn't want to give her any excuse to portray him as the uncooperative outsider who refused to engage with the local residents. He spent the morning reviewing his permits and legal documents one more time, ensuring he was prepared for whatever accusations she planned to present. The meeting was set to take place in Karen's backyard. As Ethan approached her property, he noticed a small group of neighbors gathered around, some of whom had been openly hostile toward him in recent days. Karen had positioned herself near a folding table draped with a white cloth, upon which sat a neatly arranged stack of papers. She wore her usual air of smug self-righteousness, and as Ethan walked up, she greeted him with an overly polite but insincere smile. "Oh, Ethan, I'm so glad you decided to join us," she said in a syrupy tone that made it clear she didn't mean a word of it. "We were just about to begin." Ethan nodded curtly but didn't respond. He took a seat near the back, observing the other attendees. There were about 15 people present, most of them residents from nearby houses. Some looked genuinely curious about what was going to be discussed, while others had clearly been influenced by Karen's rhetoric and regarded Ethan with suspicion. Once everyone was seated, Karen began her speech. "Thank you all for coming today," she said, projecting her voice with a practiced air of authority. "As many of you know, there has been some concern recently about changes taking place in our neighborhood, specifically the installation of a large, rather disruptive gate at the entrance to Mr. Carter's property." She paused for effect, glancing around to gauge the crowd's reaction. Ethan could see several people nodding in agreement, though a few looked skeptical. Karen continued, "This neighborhood has always prided itself on maintaining a certain aesthetic harmony. We believe in preserving the character and charm of our community, and while we all respect Mr. Carter's right to improve his property, we also believe that these changes should be made in consultation with the rest of us." Ethan remained silent, letting her finish her speech before taking any action. He could tell Karen was attempting to position herself as a reasonable, concerned neighbor rather than the vindictive busybody she truly was. Once she concluded, she opened the floor for comments. A few neighbors spoke up, expressing vague concerns about how the gate affected the neighborhood's ambiance. Others complained that they hadn't been informed about Ethan's plans beforehand. Finally, Ethan decided it was time to speak. He stood up, holding a folder containing all of his paperwork. "Thank you for giving me the opportunity to respond," he began, maintaining a calm and professional tone. First of all, I want to clarify a few things. Every modification I've made to my property, including the installation of the gate, has been done in full compliance with local regulations. I obtained all the necessary permits and approvals before beginning any work. I have copies of these documents here if anyone would like to review them. He held up the folder briefly before continuing. I understand that change can be unsettling, especially in a neighborhood that values tradition, but I want to assure you that my intention has never been to disrupt the community. I moved here to restore a family home and create something beautiful, not to cause conflict. Ethan could see that his measured approach was affecting some of the neighbors. A few exchanged glances, seemingly reconsidering their initial hostility. However, Karen wasn't about to let him off that easily. "That may be true, Ethan," she said, her voice dripping with feigned sympathy. "But just because something is legal doesn't necessarily mean it's right. We're not questioning your permits. We're questioning whether this gate is in the best interest of the neighborhood." Ethan resisted the urge to roll his eyes. Karen's ability to twist any situation to fit her narrative was almost impressive. "With all due respect, Karen," he replied, "I'm not sure how a gate on my private property affects anyone else's quality of life. It's not blocking access to anything. It's not causing any harm. The only thing it's doing is providing me with the privacy and security that every homeowner has a right to." Karen opened her mouth to respond, but before she could, another neighbor, Jack, the older man who had visited Ethan earlier, spoke up. "I think Ethan has a point," he said, his voice carrying a note of quiet authority. "We've all seen the work he's been doing on the house. He's putting a lot of effort into restoring it, and frankly, I think it's going to improve the overall look of the neighborhood once it's finished. Maybe we should give him a chance instead of jumping to conclusions." Several heads turned toward Jack, and Ethan could see that his words had resonated with some attendees. Even Karen seemed momentarily taken aback by the unexpected show of support. Sensing the tide was beginning to turn against her, she quickly attempted to regain control of the situation. "Well, I suppose we can agree to disagree," she said with a tight-lipped smile. "But I still believe it's important for the community to have a say in matters that affect us all. That's why I've taken the liberty of drafting a petition to formally request a review of Mr. Carter's gate by the local council." She held up a clipboard with a sheet of paper attached, clearly expecting the neighbors to line up and sign it. Ethan felt his frustration rise, but forced himself to remain composed. He knew that reacting emotionally would only play into Karen's hands. Instead, he addressed the group once more. "You're all free to do as you wish," he said, keeping his tone even. "But before you sign anything, I would encourage you to think about what kind of precedent this sets. If a neighbor can be forced to alter or remove something on their property simply because it doesn't fit someone else's idea of what's appropriate, where does it end? Today, it's my gate. Tomorrow, it could be your garden, your fence, or your choice of exterior paint." There was a murmur of agreement from a few people in the crowd, and Ethan could see Karen's grip on the situation beginning to slip. Realizing her petition wasn't garnering the overwhelming support she had hoped for, she quickly concluded the meeting, thanking everyone for attending and promising to keep the neighborhood's best interests at heart. As the crowd dispersed, several neighbors approached Ethan to express their support. Jack and Maria were among them. "You handled that well," Jack said with a grin. "Karen's been running this neighborhood for too long. It's about time someone stood up to her." Ethan thanked them, feeling a mix of relief and exhaustion. He had won this round, but he knew Karen wouldn't give up easily. She had made it clear she considered him a threat to her self-imposed authority and wasn't the type to back down without a fight. In the days that followed, things remained relatively quiet. Ethan continued with his restoration work, keeping an eye out for any further signs of trouble. He also followed up with his lawyer, who advised him to stay vigilant and continue documenting everything. One evening, as Ethan was locking up for the night, he noticed something unusual near the edge of his property. A dark car was parked across the street, its headlights off. The driver's silhouette was barely visible, but it was clear someone was watching his house. Ethan felt a chill run down his spine. This wasn't just Karen stirring up trouble anymore. Something more serious was unfolding. Over the next few days, the uneasy calm that had settled over the neighborhood began to unravel. Ethan could feel it in the way people glanced at him when he stepped outside or walked down the street. It wasn't open hostility anymore. Karen had lost some of her influence after the community meeting, but there was still a palpable tension in the air. Ethan had dealt with enough people like Karen in the past to know she wouldn't simply give up and move on. She wasn't someone who accepted defeat gracefully, and the fact that she hadn't made another move yet only heightened his suspicions. He didn't have to wait long for things to escalate again. Early one morning, Ethan was jolted awake by the sharp mechanical sound of drilling coming from outside. Confused and still half asleep, he quickly threw on some clothes and went to investigate. As he approached the gate, he saw a group of workers in orange vests standing around with power tools and machinery. They were accompanied by a man in a dark suit who appeared to be supervising the operation. "What's going on here?" Ethan demanded, raising his voice to be heard over the noise. The man in the suit turned to him, offering a thin, professional smile that didn't reach his eyes. "Good morning, Mr. Carter. We're here on behalf of the city to conduct an inspection of your gate and driveway. There have been complaints about potential safety hazards." Ethan's eyes narrowed. "Complaints from whom?" "I'm not at liberty to disclose that," the man replied smoothly. "However, the city has authorized this inspection and will need to conduct a full assessment. If any violations are found, you may be required to make changes or remove the structure entirely." Ethan felt a surge of anger but forced himself to remain calm. He knew exactly who was behind this. Karen. She hadn't managed to sway the neighbors to her side, so now she was leveraging city bureaucracy to apply pressure. It was a tactic as underhanded as it was effective. "Fine," Ethan said through gritted teeth, "but I want to see your authorization papers." The man handed him a clipboard with a printed document bearing the city's official seal. Ethan scanned the page quickly, noting it was a legitimate order. There was no point in arguing with the workers. They were merely doing their job, but he wasn't about to let Karen's schemes go unanswered. As the inspection continued, Ethan took out his phone and called his lawyer. He explained the situation in a low, measured tone, keeping an eye on the workers as they examined his gate and driveway. His lawyer advised him to cooperate for now, but to document everything in case they needed to challenge the inspection later. Once the workers finished their assessment, the man in the suit approached Ethan again. "We didn't find any immediate safety violations," he said, sounding almost disappointed. "However, we'll be filing a report with the city. If any issues arise, you'll be notified." Ethan didn't bother responding. He simply watched as they packed up their equipment and left. The entire ordeal had been a waste of time, but it served as a reminder that Karen wasn't done with him yet. If anything, this latest stunt showed she was willing to go to great lengths to get what she wanted. That evening, Ethan received another anonymous note in his mailbox. This one was shorter than the last, but the message was just as clear. "You should have listened. Things will only get worse from here." Ethan folded the note carefully and added it to his growing file of documentation. He wasn't sure what Karen's next move would be, but he was determined to stay one step ahead. The next morning, Ethan woke up to find several bags of garbage scattered across his driveway. Someone had clearly dumped them there in the middle of the night. The bags were torn open with trash strewn across the ground, creating a disgusting mess. Ethan sighed in frustration but didn't waste any time dwelling on it. He grabbed a pair of gloves and a trash bag and got to work cleaning it up. As he worked, he noticed Jack, the older neighbor who had spoken up in his defense during the meeting, approaching from down the street. "Morning, Ethan," Jack said, his brow furrowed in concern. "Looks like someone's trying to make your life difficult." "Yeah, it's been like this for a while now," Ethan replied, tossing a broken soda can into the trash bag. "I appreciate your support, by the way. Not everyone's been as understanding." Jack nodded. "Karen's been causing trouble around here for years. She doesn't like it when things don't go her way. Most people just go along with her to avoid conflict. But I've had enough of her nonsense. If you need anything, let me know." "Thanks, Jack. I might take you up on that," Ethan said sincerely. It was a small comfort to know not everyone in the neighborhood had turned against him. Later that day, Ethan decided to take proactive steps to protect himself. He contacted a private security company and arranged for them to conduct regular patrols around his property. It was an expense he hadn't planned for, but given the circumstances, it seemed necessary. He also installed additional motion-activated floodlights around the perimeter of his property, ensuring that any nighttime intruders would be immediately exposed. Meanwhile, Karen continued her campaign. She filed another complaint with the city, this time alleging that Ethan's driveway was causing drainage issues for nearby properties. Once again, city inspectors were sent out, but they found no evidence to support her claims. Frustrated but undeterred, Karen began circulating yet another petition among the neighbors, this one calling for stricter regulations on property modifications. Despite her efforts, Ethan noticed fewer people were willing to engage with her this time. It seemed some neighbors were growing tired of her antics, especially since Ethan had been courteous and respectful throughout the ordeal. Nevertheless, Karen wasn't someone who gave up easily, and Ethan knew that as long as she was around, the conflict would continue. One evening, as Ethan was reviewing his notes and legal documents, he received an unexpected call from his lawyer. Ethan, I've been looking into some of the complaints Karen's been filing," the lawyer said. "I did some digging, and it turns out she has connections with a local developer who's been trying to buy up properties in your area. It's possible that all of this isn't just about aesthetics. It might be about pushing you to sell." Ethan felt a chill run down his spine. The idea that Karen might be collaborating with someone else to force him out of the neighborhood added a new layer of complexity to the situation. "Thanks for letting me know," he said. "I'll keep that in mind." After the call ended, Ethan sat back in his chair, deep in thought. If Karen was indeed acting on behalf of a developer, the stakes were higher than he'd initially realized. This wasn't just a petty neighborhood dispute anymore. It was about money and power. Determined not to be intimidated, Ethan began preparing for whatever came next. He updated his lawyer on the latest developments, reviewed his legal options, and continued documenting every interaction and incident. He also started reaching out to a few local organizations that dealt with property rights and historic preservation, hoping to gain additional support. As the days went by, Ethan couldn't shake the feeling that something bigger was brewing. Karen's behavior had become increasingly erratic, and it was clear she was growing desperate. The question wasn't whether she would make another move. It was when and how far she would go. All Ethan could do now was stay vigilant and be ready for whatever came his way. The sense of unease lingered over Ethan Carter like a dark cloud. Days had passed since his lawyer revealed that Karen might be working with a developer, and the tension had only intensified. Ethan continued his routine of restoring the house, keeping his property in order, and preparing for any further antics Karen might throw his way. But deep down, he knew things were approaching a breaking point. Karen wasn't the type to back down quietly, especially if she was being backed by someone with deeper pockets and bigger plans. The breaking point came on an otherwise quiet afternoon. Ethan had just finished installing another section of decorative fencing when he noticed a commotion near the edge of his property. He wiped the sweat from his brow and walked toward the gate, only to find Karen standing there with two men in suits, accompanied by a small crowd of curious neighbors gathering nearby. The men carried clipboards and looked official enough to warrant concern. "Good afternoon, Ethan," Karen said, her voice dripping with smug satisfaction. "I'm sure you've already guessed why we're here." Ethan crossed his arms, keeping his tone calm despite the irritation bubbling inside him. "Not really, but I'm sure you're about to tell me." One of the men in suits stepped forward. "Mr. Carter, we're representatives from the city's Planning and Zoning Department. We've received multiple complaints regarding unauthorized modifications to your property and potential code violations. We're here to conduct a formal inspection." Ethan's jaw tightened. This wasn't a surprise. It was exactly the kind of move Karen would make when all her other attempts failed. Still, he wasn't about to let her rattle him. "I've already been through inspections," he said firmly. "Everything I've done has been cleared by the city. You're welcome to check my permits." "We'll need to inspect the property ourselves to verify that," the man replied. "If you refuse, we'll have no choice but to escalate this to a legal proceeding." Karen, standing a few steps behind the inspectors, was clearly enjoying herself. Ethan could almost hear her internal monologue. "Gotcha now, outsider." "Fine," Ethan said, stepping aside and opening the gate. "Go ahead, but you won't find anything out of order." The inspectors walked onto the property and began their work, carefully noting measurements, taking photos, and checking various aspects of the renovations. Meanwhile, Karen stood just outside the gate with her arms crossed, wearing that ever-present smirk. Ethan ignored her, focusing instead on following the inspectors to ensure they didn't overlook anything important. As the inspection dragged on, more neighbors gathered to watch the unfolding drama. Jack and Maria, Ethan's supportive neighbors, appeared as well, standing off to the side with concerned expressions. "This is ridiculous," Jack muttered under his breath as Ethan passed by. "She's just trying to wear you down." Ethan gave him a brief nod but didn't respond. He knew Jack was right. This was Karen's latest attempt to harass him into giving up, and if he lost his temper, she'd use it against him. He had to stay calm and see this through. After nearly an hour, the inspectors concluded their work. They gathered near the gate, flipping through their notes as Ethan approached. "We didn't find any violations," one of them admitted, though he didn't look particularly pleased. "Your permits are in order, and everything appears to comply with city regulations." Karen's expression darkened, and Ethan could see the frustration flicker across her face. She clearly hadn't anticipated things going this way. Still, she wasn't about to let it end there. "Are you sure you didn't miss anything?" she asked the inspectors, her tone laced with thinly veiled annoyance. "There must be something wrong. I mean, just look at this place. It doesn't fit the neighborhood at all." The inspectors exchanged awkward glances, clearly uncomfortable with her persistence. "Ma'am, we've conducted a thorough inspection and we didn't find any issues. If you have further concerns, you're welcome to file another complaint with the department, but for now, this case is closed." Karen opened her mouth to protest, but seemed to think better of it. Instead, she turned on her heel and stalked off toward her house, leaving the crowd murmuring among themselves. Some of the neighbors seemed amused by the outcome, while others looked disappointed that they hadn't gotten the spectacle they were hoping for. Ethan thanked the inspectors and watched as they left. Once the crowd began to disperse, Jack and Maria walked over, both looking relieved. "Glad that's over," Maria said with a smile. "You handled that well." "Thanks," Ethan replied, "but I don't think this is the end of it. Karen's not going to stop until she gets what she wants." "You're probably right," Jack agreed. "But at least more people are starting to see her for what she is. She's losing credibility." Ethan hoped Jack was right, but he wasn't ready to relax just yet. That evening, he sat down with his lawyer and went over his options. They discussed possible legal actions he could take if Karen continued to harass him, including filing a formal complaint against her for repeated false accusations. It was a step Ethan didn't want to take unless absolutely necessary, but he was beginning to realize he might not have a choice. Just when it seemed things couldn't get more complicated, Ethan received an unexpected email later that night. It was from a local journalist who had heard about the ongoing conflict and wanted to interview him for a story about neighborhood disputes and property rights. Ethan was hesitant at first. He didn't want to escalate things further by involving the media, but after discussing it with his lawyer, he decided it might be worth considering. If Karen wanted to play dirty, he wasn't above using public exposure to level the playing field. As he closed his laptop and prepared for bed, Ethan felt a strange sense of both exhaustion and resolve. This fight had gone on longer than he'd ever anticipated, and while he didn't enjoy being at the center of so much attention, he wasn't about to back down now. Karen had thrown everything she could at him, and he was still standing. If she wanted to keep pushing, she'd soon find out he wasn't someone who could be intimidated into submission. The next day, as Ethan walked out to his driveway, he noticed something new. A small camera mounted on a pole near Karen's property pointed directly at his gate. He shook his head, a mix of disbelief and annoyance coursing through him. It seemed Karen had found a new tactic: constant surveillance. He took a deep breath, forcing himself to stay calm. This was just another attempt to rattle him, to provoke a reaction, but Ethan wasn't going to give her the satisfaction. Instead, he pulled out his phone, took a few pictures of the camera, and sent them to his lawyer. He was done playing defense. It was time to go on the offensive. If Karen thought she could outlast him, she was in for a rude awakening. Ethan had already proven he wasn't going anywhere, and now, with the law and public opinion slowly turning in his favor, he was ready to end this battle once and for all. The morning after discovering the surveillance camera pointed directly at his property, Ethan knew it was time to take decisive action. Karen had crossed every imaginable line, and her latest move was both invasive and borderline illegal. After sending photos of the camera to his lawyer, Ethan received a call within the hour. "Ethan, I've reviewed the situation," his lawyer said, sounding more determined than ever. "We now have enough grounds to file a formal harassment complaint against Karen. Document everything," the lawyer advised. "We're going to build a case, and if she keeps this up, she'll face serious legal consequences. I'll also reach out to the city about that camera. It's likely a violation of local privacy laws." Ethan hung up, feeling a renewed sense of control. For weeks, Karen had been on the offensive, using every bureaucratic trick in the book to harass him. But now the tables were turning, and he was ready to push back with the full force of the law. Over the next couple of days, Ethan worked closely with his lawyer, compiling all the evidence: photos of the vandalism, copies of the anonymous notes, documentation of the repeated city inspections, and now the surveillance camera aimed at his gate. Meanwhile, word of Karen's antics had spread beyond the neighborhood. Ethan hadn't approached the media himself, but it seemed someone else had. A small article appeared on a local news blog, detailing the ongoing feud and portraying Karen in a negative light. The headline read, "Art or Neighborhood Tyranny? Local Dispute Sparks Debate." Though the piece remained neutral, simply reporting the facts, it was clear which side readers were inclined to support. Comments flooded in, many criticizing Karen's behavior and praising Ethan's patience in dealing with her. The backlash didn't stop there. A few neighbors who had initially sided with Karen began distancing themselves from her, unwilling to be associated with the growing public scrutiny. Jack and Maria, ever supportive, mentioned that several people had approached them, expressing regret for not standing up to Karen sooner. Then came the moment Ethan had been waiting for. Late one afternoon, a city official arrived at his house to personally inform him that the camera Karen had installed violated municipal regulations. She had not filed for the necessary permits and, worse, it was positioned in a way that directly infringed on Ethan's right to privacy. The official assured Ethan that Karen would be ordered to remove it immediately or face a hefty fine. When the camera was taken down the next morning, Ethan noticed a change in Karen's demeanor. She no longer wore her smug, self-assured expression. Instead, she seemed tense, avoiding eye contact with anyone as she hurried in and out of her house. It was clear Karen's control over the neighborhood and her confidence were rapidly diminishing. The final blow came a few days later when Ethan's lawyer informed him that they had filed a formal harassment claim against Karen. Along with the complaint, they submitted all the collected evidence, including witness statements from neighbors like Jack and Maria. The city, no longer willing to entertain Karen's baseless complaints, launched an investigation into her actions. It didn't take long for officials to realize that Karen had been abusing the system, filing false reports and wasting city resources. Faced with mounting legal pressure and a rapidly deteriorating reputation, Karen did the one thing no one expected. She sold her house. Within weeks, a moving truck appeared in her driveway, and before long, she was gone. No farewell speeches, no final attempts to stir up trouble. Just a quiet exit that left the neighborhood in a collective state of relief. With Karen out of the picture, the atmosphere in the neighborhood shifted dramatically. People who had once avoided Ethan now approached him with friendly greetings. Some even apologized for believing Karen's lies. Jack and Maria hosted a small gathering to celebrate the end of the ordeal, inviting Ethan and several other neighbors. For the first time since he'd moved in, Ethan felt he could truly relax as he stood on his newly restored porch, watching the sunset with a cold drink in hand. Ethan reflected on everything that had transpired. What had started as a simple restoration project had evolved into a battle of wills, a test of his patience and resilience. But in the end, he hadn't just restored a house. He'd earned the respect of a community and proven that standing up for oneself, even when the odds are stacked against you, is always worthwhile. Later that night, Ethan walked down his driveway and closed the gate behind him. The gate that had sparked so much conflict now stood tall and proud, a symbol of his perseverance. He smiled to himself as he locked it, knowing that whatever challenges lay ahead, he was ready to face them.